The Bible does not ban women from teaching. Our traditions and inherited theology masquerading as gospel truth do. Imagine being told that your role in the called out assembly was to listen. Only. Not to teach, not to lead, that the only place that was appropriate for you was in the back seat. Just shh. This is a man's place, not a woman's. Now imagine telling someone like me that. When I first heard about the 2 verses that are attributed to Paul and what he says about women sharing the gospel, I had questions, and mostly loud ones. Because here's the thing, I actually love scripture. So my spidey senses pricked up quickly. I know Yah did not wire me incorrectly. And Paul also talks about the different spiritual gifts. He doesn't base them off of somebody's sex. I knew I had to look into this more closely. I was not surprised to find that a lot of what we teach about this topic is completely taken out of context. Go figure. If you're new here, this is part 6 in my Biblical Womanhood series. I am tackling all of the verses that are commonly used in our theology. I'm going back to the Hebrew, I'm going back to the Greek, and I'm going back to the context and culture in which these verses were written in. It is astounding to me how much purposeful manipulation in the text there has been. But God leaves us with an open invitation. Seek and ye shall find. That's what I'm doing in this series. So if you missed the first 5 parts, they're linked in the description box down below, as well as my free downloadable guide to how to start studying the scriptures in their original language if this is something that you want to start diving into on your own. When I started really diving into this conversation that surrounds women not being allowed to teach men, I couldn't help but think that it was in contradiction to what Yahuwah said in the original Testament. You know, I'm the type of person where I bless people in checkout lines instead of saying, have a good day. When I learn something meaningful, it's in my marrow to share it. Silence is not exactly my spiritual gift. And while Yah refines us in every area, I couldn't help but think he didn't wire me in properly. He's got to have a use for my temperament. I was not surprised to find that once we actually start unpacking what's happening surrounding these verses, a completely different picture emerges. There are really 2 verses in question, the one in 1 Timothy and the one in 1 Corinthians. Starting off in 1 Timothy, he states, "Let the woman learn in silence with all subjugation. But I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence." Most of our modern teachings assume that Paul was laying down a universal, once and for all ban on women in leadership. But there's a lot more going on in the original language and context surrounding this verse than we've been taught. Why was Paul addressing this at all? Because Ephesus was home to the Temple of Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the world. And the Temple of Artemis was saturated with pagan worship and female priestesses. So when they're coming into the congregation of the Messiah, they're bringing with them all of this baggage from pagan worship, when they're used to being in this temple, asserting spiritual authority through pagan rituals and worship. They're bringing that same framework, that same domineering style, that same pagan roots into the congregation, which can be deeply confusing when you're trying to practically figure out how do you walk in the way of Messiah. It wasn't about teaching, it was about spreading deception from the roots where these specific women were coming from. Paul's correction was not a blanket ban on women. It was a targeted response to a very specific issue that was going on in that community. The words to take note of here, there are a couple that we're going to look at, but the first would be the authority word. The word he uses here for usurping authority, authentein, is very uncommon and is only used one time in the New Testament. In Greek writings in this same culture, this word is typically used to describe domination, control, even abuse, and acting violently. This was not teaching with authority. This was hijacking the mic, twisting doctrine, and causing dissent. Because in Ephesus, some women were doing exactly that based on the cult that they were coming from. And based on the temple culture in this setting, Paul was not condemning a calling. He was correcting the chaos. This word authentein is a rare and loaded term. Paul had many other Greek words to draw from that weren't directly correlated to abuse, but he didn't choose those. He also uses the word silence, which this word actually does not mean complete quiet. If Paul had meant that, there are other words that he would have used, which do mean total silence. But the word that he used here, he used hēsychia, which means quietness, stillness, or peacefulness. So we have this contrast, abuse of authority being replaced with peace. Paul was not saying that women should never speak or never lead. He was saying that they needed to learn the posture of calm and humility in order to learn properly, because something messy was happening in that community. We know that Paul didn't believe that women should stay silent, because just a few pages over in 1 Corinthians, he affirms women praying and prophesying publicly. That is not exactly silent behavior. And one thing that we completely skip over is this radical command to learn. This may not stand out to us in our culture now, but back then, in the first century Jewish and Greco-Roman world, women were typically excluded from formal instruction in the Torah. They could listen in the synagogues, but systematic discipleship? That was reserved for the men. Paul once again flips the script. By commanding women in Ephesus to learn in quietness, to learn in peace, he is opening the door to education that had been barred from so many women. The call to quietness or peacefulness here is not to put a muzzle on half of the population. It is to encourage a normal student posture of humility and attentiveness. He was not silencing women, he was dignifying them as disciples. He was actually telling them, you have a place in the classroom of the Messiah. Just think about that. The very same Paul that we quote today to say to women to shut up was the one defending their right to learn, to know the word for themselves. I'd be saying though, what about 1 Corinthians? This one gets really dicey. Let your women keep quiet in the assemblies. Here's something that you're probably going to think I'm nuts, but bear with me here because I have data to back it up. The likelihood that Paul didn't even write this is extremely high. Textual scholar Philip Payne, who is the author of The Bible versus Biblical Womanhood, is the first one that I heard this from. And he notes that this specific passage is written in a different ink than the surrounding passages are, indicating it was a later addition by a different hand. And believe it or not, it gets even weirder. In several early manuscripts, that verse doesn't even appear in the same place. Sometimes it's around 34, sometimes it's after verse 40, like a scribal sticky note that got folded into the text. It is not consistent in where it appears. And it's not just the ink or the location either. Payne notes that in every single Western manuscript that we have, the scribes marked this verse with a sigla, which is a marginal symbol used to denote disputed text. In other words, even the earliest copyists weren't even sure that those lines belonged to Paul. That's huge, because unlike a lot of the people in my comment section that assert the work that I'm doing is a modern feminist movement, because somehow looking into Hebrew and Greek in the original language that God wrote it in is a feminist movement now, this context means that the doubt of these verses would not be part of a modern feminist movement because they trace back to the earliest transmitters of Scripture. Whether you believe that Paul wrote them or not, which I believe that the evidence supports that he did not actually write that piece of text, there's one thing that is absolutely true. The church inherited disputed text and has built an entire doctrine of women being silent around it. And the other thing is, from a flow perspective, this verse is weird. Paul is talking about spiritual gifts and prophecy, and then all of a sudden women be silent, and then he's back to spiritual gifts and prophecy? Even if you're not a scholar, your spidey senses should be tingling. But here's the bottom line. Whether this text was added later or just misunderstood, it still doesn't mean what the church has been teaching. And how can I assert that with such confidence? Because if Paul was anti-women in leadership, somebody forgot to tell, well, Paul. Because the same man who supposedly told women to stay silent affirmed, named, and partnered with multiple women in roles of leadership, teaching, and apostleship, such as Priscilla. In Acts 18, her and her husband teach Apollos, who is a powerful teacher, the ways of Elohim more perfectly to him. And in this context, Paul points to Priscilla before her husband, which would have been very uncommon in that era. Highly unusual in a male-dominated culture. This really does reflect her prominence. She wasn't a silent sidekick, she was a theological heavyweight. And then there are women like Phoebe. Paul introduces Phoebe as a deacon in Romans 16 to many, including himself. And get this, Phoebe was the one who delivered the letter to the Romans, which isn't just about being a postal worker. It meant that Paul trusted her to explain its content and answer questions on his behalf. He didn't just trust her to carry the gospel, he trusted her to teach it. And one of my favorite examples, Junia, who you can find in Romans 16 as well. Why one of my favorite examples? Because this in particular shows the purposeful mistranslation to try to write women out of the Bible. She was well known among the apostles. Early church fathers recognized her as an apostle. But because this did not fit with the church's paradigm as time went on, they literally masculinized her name to make it look like a male apostle, changing the name Junia to Junius, which isn't even a real Greek name. Let that sink in. Paul affirms a female apostle, and because she didn't fit the paradigm, the church literally tried to write her out of Scripture. But for all of those who still argue, well, Paul may have worked with women, but they weren't really leading, allow me to introduce to you a very inconvenient judge and one of my personal role models, Deborah. She wasn't just a prophetess. She wasn't just wise. She was the leader of all of Israel, appointed by Yahuwah the Lord himself. And Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, she judged Israel at the time. Judges 4:4. Deborah held spiritual, military, and civil authority. She gave orders to generals. She settled disputes, heard directly from Yahuwah, and she did it all without a whisper of rebuke from him. Which raises the obvious question. If Yahuwah had no problem placing a woman over the entire nation, why would Paul have a problem with women sharing the gospel in the assembly? Deborah stands as a blazing rebuttal to any theology that says that women should never lead. Because she did not ask for permission. She didn't apologize for her calling. She walked out what Yahuwah asked her to in faith. She obeyed the word of Elohim, and all of Israel followed. That's not rebellion. That's righteousness. Deborah was not just an exception to the rule. She was the kind of leader Elohim appointed when nobody else was listening. It kind of reminds me of the women who proclaimed, "He is risen," when nobody else was there. We'll get into that more in the next video. And when we line her story up with women like Priscilla and Phoebe and Junia, the argument of universal female silence doesn't just weaken, it collapses. So let's stop pretending that Paul was doing something that Yah himself never did. Let's stop building doctrine on mistranslations and manuscripts that can't even make up their mind. Let's take a look at what we've inherited and what we've really missed in the process. Paul was not laying out a universal gag order. And he definitely was not contradicting Elohim, who called Devorah, anointed Miriam, and empowered Junia. So no, sister, you don't have to sit down and shut up. You don't have to stay quiet just because you're a female. You were never disqualified. You were designed to speak truth, to prophesy boldly, and to carry the gospel into every corner that Yah calls you to. Paul's letters have been horribly misunderstood. When he was there lifting women up, imagine how much more powerful the body of Yahusha could be if we were all building each other up and all spreading the gospel and all teaching out of the revelation that Yahuwah gives us, instead of pretending he only talks to half of the population. And if Paul's letters have been misunderstood, you'll love where we're heading next, the life of Yahusha. Because in a world that pushed women to the sidelines, he brought them into the center of the story. I can't wait to build off of this more next week. Don't forget to take a peek in that description box. I have that free download for studying the Hebrew and Greek in their original languages. I have a link to my upcoming book that's due to be released in February. I have links to all of my different YouTube videos on this topic so far. This was part 6 of 10 is what I used to say, but the more research I do, I'm finding the need to put together more content. So likely, who are we kidding? I like to talk. 10 parts probably won't even be enough. But as the Spirit moves, I'll continue to put out more information. What is an obscure passage in relation to women that has always kind of made you go, I don't really know what that means? Drop that in the comment box down below. The more content that I'm putting out, the more objections that I'm getting, which help me look at the broader text. What God's language actually supports. So if there's something where you're like, yeah, but what did this mean? Drop it in the comments down below and I'll see if I can't do a deep dive on that and add it to this series. Until next time, don't forget to test everything and hold fast to what is good. May Yah bless and keep you. May He make His light shine upon you and give you peace. I'll catch you on that flippity flop. Shalom.